Okay. All right, so the purposes of these workshops are to give you guys just kind of like a 30-minute breakdown of something. What I'm going to be tailoring most of my workshops towards is troubleshooting. So this is really kind of the first introduction to a troubleshooting workshop. One of the things that I find very common with junior developers is the primary tasks that you will be given when you get a job is not to go build something, but rather it's to go fix something. So what I hope to do is to give you guys some kind of like an idea, a general outline of what you need to do to solve problems. And in this case, we're going to be looking at a particular issue with a Spring Framework application. I've got a web API, I've got code written, and there's something wrong with it, okay? So it's going to be, I'm going to walk you guys through, and hopefully, actually, I would like to have you guys tell me what to do, would be even a better way to go about it. But essentially, there's a problem here with the code, and we need to fix it, okay? So what I typically do is I break up the process into two very specific parts. Whenever I have code that's not working, the first thing I need to do is, well, I guess actually I should say that there's three. It depends. I kind of tie the first and the second one together. But the first thing is identify in the code where the problem is. Okay, where is the problem? And that is a lot. There are actually more things that go into that than what you might initially think of. Typically what I try to do is, first and foremost, where's the first place you should go to find out what the error is? Anybody have an idea?
Your console.
Your console.
Well, the code.
Yeah, the console tells you, right? The console gives you an error message and tells you, hey, this isn't working. And not only that, but it actually tells you like where in the code it's not working. Now that really only leads us to one part of solving that particular conundrum, because all that really tells you is what operation, where in the code did that operation fail. It doesn't necessarily tell you the root of the cause. It just tells you, hey, when it tried to run this operation, it couldn't. That doesn't mean that that one specific line is actually where the problem is. It may be. It may be something you can do to that line to fix it, but maybe not. Maybe you have to go find the root of the problem. And to go find the root of the problem often means you need to extract more information about what the error actually means and what that code is trying to do. And that's what we're going to run into with this particular problem that I have for you guys today. So let me pull up my window here. And I've got an application here. It's just a very simple books and authors application. This is a web API. There's no views on it. It's just controllers, models, repositories, and what I call a view model. Now, what's happening here is I've got my application, which is just a typical application here. It's a Spring application with Spring Boot set up. I've got a controllers package where I only have one controller. It's called the Books controller. And if we take a look at it, we'll find that there are two actions on this controller. Now, I don't know how far you guys are into the program, but essentially what a controller does is it receives the request from the user. So in general, a web API is essentially a web server that is responding to requests and returning, instead of a view, it returns something like JSON or XML, okay, some sort of data that is not a view. So just for example, I'm going to go ahead and get this application up and running, and I'm going to demonstrate to you essentially what the main purpose of a web API is, just for those of you who are not quite caught up on what this concept is just yet. While this is loading up, a front end is essentially, in case nobody's ever explained this to you, the front end, if you guys learned React or Angular or any of those front end frameworks, this HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and Angular or React, that is essentially what makes up the front end application, what the user sees, okay, the user interface. That does not contain the business logic. It does not contain the connection to the database. It does not contain the actual data, right? It's where the user is interacting with something. The API side of things is where you actually contain the business logic. What does the business need to do? Does this user have access to the data? What is the form of the data that we need to respond back with? What is the data out of the database that we need to get? Sometimes it's authentication and login and logging, okay? So the business rules, the stuff that the business cares about is what we call the back end, where we're kind of managing what is actually happening on our side internally. And this happens on the back end, which is usually some sort of service. Now in this case, my service is going to be running on localhost port 8080. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to localhost port 8080. Now, what I'm using here is Postman. Postman is kind of a way for us to talk to an API, to any web server, talk to any web server, and basically ask it, I can basically ask it, hey, give me some information back. Like I'm going to send you a request, you send me a response. Now for web servers, so if I'm going to a website, what I'm going to receive back is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. A website responds back with that, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, a web API doesn't serve back an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript document. Instead, it returns back something like JSON or XML. Okay, some sort of just the raw data, not a whole HTML document, but just raw data. So in this particular case, if we go to my books controller, I'm going to see that there's a mapping here, okay? And this has to do with routing. So we've all gone to websites before, and we've seen like google.com/Gmail or something like that, right? We have a / and then something. And this is what we call routing. It's a route, okay? Some sort of place in the application that we want to go, place in the website, web server that we want to go. And on our JavaScript, or on our Java side, we actually map those routes to a controller. And a controller is really just a Java class that we create to handle that request. In this particular case, we are mapping this books controller to respond to a route of /API. Okay, so the controller is mapped to this API, but then we have two functions in here. One called getBooks, and the getBooks function responds to the mapping of getBooks. So to get to this particular endpoint, what I would need to put in for Postman is the server name, which is localhost 8080. This is the actual service that's hosting my application. And then I would need to do API and then /getBooks, because that's the mapping that I have here, API getBooks. And that will then perform this getBooks function, okay? Now the getBooks function is doing something very simple. It's going to my repository, and my repository is a book repository. And I don't mean the one that Lee Harvey Oswald was in. This is a repository where we are keeping track of books, where we have CRUD functionality on our books, okay? So we're using something called an object relational mapper. More specifically, we're using JPA, okay? JPA is an object relational mapper that essentially says, I have a table on a database, and I need to bring that table in as a set of objects in Java. So my book repository is essentially my table. Book repository is essentially my table of books, okay? So that's essentially the way you can think of it. This is a table of books. Now, on that repository, I'm going to do a find all method, which returns back all of my books, all of the data that's in my books. And it will return back in the form of this iterable of book. Now, a book is over here in my models, and we'll see that a book is an entity, it's a model, and we have an ID, we have a title, we have an author, okay? So every book has an ID, a title, and an author. And of course, that makes sense. If we worked with databases before, we should know that a database is going to have a primary key that's typically called ID. It's going to have a string called title. And then we also have a reference. Sometimes we have a reference to something else, to another table. In this case, the reference would be to a person. So we actually have a second table of person, okay, or people. And that person, specifically associated with a book, is an author. So we could keep track of people in our database. One of those people in our database is the author of this book. And so that's how we're going to have it, right? Our database, we have that same relationship. We have books. We could say this book has a relationship to that author or that person in the form of this ID for the books controller belongs to that person, or that person is that author. So let's go back to our books controller. Very simply, what's going to happen is if I do this API get books, I'm going to do a get method. Okay, so this is a get method. For APIs, get, post, put, and delete are the 4 primary actions that you do on an API. And if that sounds familiar, 4 things that you do to access a resource sounds familiar, that's because we also have the same 4 functions to a database table. You have create, read, update, delete. Get, post, put, delete. Those are actually basically the same things. They're slightly different order though. So a get method on an API basically says, hey API, can you get this information for me? I want to read it. So it's the read functionality. A post is essentially the create functionality. I want to create something with a post. So I'm telling the API, here's some information, go create that thing. A put is associated with an update. So I have an object that already exists in my API. I want you to update it with this new information. I want you to make a change to that thing. And then finally, delete is, of course, delete. I have a resource somewhere in the API. I want you to go ahead and remove it, get rid of it, okay? So it's the same 4 pieces of functionality that we would find in a database: create, read, update, and delete. It's just that we have different names for it in the web sphere. We call it get, post, put, and delete. But they're essentially the same things. I want to get something, I want to post something, I want to put something, I want to delete something, okay? So if you think of it in those terms, you'll find that it's actually very much translatable. It's the same exact thing, just a different language that we're communicating it in. Okay, so going back here, so we've got our get books action that we want to call on API get books. And when we do that, so API get books, I'm going to send that get request, and Postman will actually show me the raw results. I have an array of objects. This is a JSON object. It's an array of objects. Okay, in this case, I have ID2, The Great Gatsby, and the author is set to null. Okay, we're good so far, right? Everything works, everything's fine. Let's try this other function though. Let's call it the get authors. Get authors. I'm going to get authors. Click send. And now we have a 500 internal server error. Okay. So we have a problem. This is the issue. This is the problem child that we need to try to troubleshoot and figure out how to fix. Okay. Now, one of the nice things that Spring is doing is it's telling us exactly what the status code is, what the error message is, sort of, and we get a path, the path that we tried to go to and where the error occurred. This in and of itself doesn't really help too much. Understand, this is a message that we would be sending from our server back to whoever's trying to consume our API. And we don't necessarily want to give them too much information, right? We don't want to tell them like, oh, well, this is on our code, this is where the error happened. Because then we're giving out information that's proprietary to how our code works. And a very resourceful hacker might be able to use that information and infiltrate our system. So the message is going to be somewhat vague. We are going to tell them that, hey, it's a 500 error. And a 500 error basically says, it's not you, it's me. Okay, sorry, our relationship is just not working out. It's not you, it's me. Okay, so that's good though, because we're essentially telling the client, we're telling whoever's trying to use our app that it's not their fault. Okay, it's not anything that they did that's wrong. It's something that we have broken in our system. And that's important for us to know too, right? It's not something that the user requested that went wrong. It's something we did wrong. So that means we need to go take a look at our console window and see what kind of errors that we're getting. And boy, do we have some errors, okay? And this can get very overwhelming for a lot of people to see the whole stack trace and go, I don't understand what all this code means. Really, what we want to focus on is just the very beginning of this message, because it's actually telling us where in our code the problem is, okay? And if we look, it says Java lang null pointer exception null, okay? More specifically, if we look at the second line, we can even see that the error happened when we tried to perform this lambda expression on our books controller Java line 37. It tells us exactly which line of code it tried to execute and had a problem with it. Right? It tells us right there. And it tells us what the error was that it encountered when it tried to run that code. So it tried to run books controller Java line 37. So here's my books controller line 37 right there. It tried to execute that line of code and had a problem. So what was the problem? What was the problem that it had? Well, the problem it had was what we saw right here. Null pointer exception. So whenever we run into an issue and we're trying to figure out, and we need to figure out, okay, now I have experience. I know exactly what this means. Like I know because I've encountered it enough times that I know exactly what the problem is. But I imagine you guys may have a, what does that mean, right? So what you guys need to do is whenever you run into an error that you are not sure of, what should you do?
Google it.
Google it. There we go. Google it. That's right. Now, what is it that we're going to Google? Aha. What are we going to Google? So I could put in error, exception, books controller, Java, right? But would any of those things actually lead us? Would any of those keywords actually lead us to a solution? And I'm probably going to say no, right? That's not really, none of those things really are going to help us much. Let me see if I can put it over there. There we go. So I'm going to exit out of this and go to my Google window here. Now, what is the actual error message? Now, here's the thing. Whenever you're Googling an issue, what you should always be looking for is something, be as specific as you possibly can without being specific to what you're doing. And what I mean by that is, if I look at my code, I'm getting a very specific error message, null pointer exception, null. But if I passed along this part about books controller Java, line 37, is Google going to know what books controller Java 37 is? No. So giving it that specific information isn't going to get me anywhere, right? Google, no one, I mean, unless somebody has stolen the code that I've written, no one is going to know what this code is doing. So there's no way that Google's going to figure it out. But I should be as specific as I can to get to the problem. And here's where we can find that. And that is if we Google this error message. Because this is really telling us exactly what the problem is. It's not telling us where the problem is, it's telling us what the problem was. So I'm going to go take that, I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to go to Google and I'm just going to drop it right in there. Look at that. First line, I got null pointer exception here, Java lang null pointer exception, preventing null pointer exceptions. I got a whole slew of results, right? Whole bunch of them. So how do we figure out which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones? Well, honestly, there's probably a bunch of them that could answer our problem. Okay, some of them, sometimes it takes a lot of in-depth looking and sometimes it's right there in front of us. One of the things that becomes very important to understand is your sources of your solutions. I've worked for large companies where if you did not cite your solution from a well-documented, well-known source, that solution, no matter whether it worked or not, was not going to be put in. Because you need to have documentation that says this is the answer, okay? In almost every case, if my solution came from Stack Overflow, brilliant. That's good enough documentation for almost everybody. And I would say about 75 to 80% of every troubleshooting issue that I've ever had to research, I've been able to find the answer on Stack Overflow. Okay, 75 to 80%. So Stack Overflow is a fantastic resource. It's not going to be the end-all, be-all for every one of your questions that you ever run into. But if you know that you're finding the solution on Stack Overflow, you know you're getting it from a good source. So I'm going to go ahead and look at this particular one. And if so here's the general question. And one of the important things to do when you're looking at Stack Overflow is make sure that the question as it's being phrased matches similarly to the error that you're having. Because you can get on a wild goose chase here if you just try to start looking for the answers and don't actually read what the question says. So the question is, what are null pointer exceptions and what causes them? What methods, tools can be used to determine the cause so that you stop the exception from causing the program to terminate prematurely? Does that sound like basically what we're running into? Is that a valid question, like comparable to what we're asking? Yeah? Okay, all right. I'm seeing a lot of heads bob yes and no, I'm not really sure. Anyway, so then the next thing is I like to go find whatever's been marked as the answer. Okay, whatever's been marked as the answer in Stack Overflow is typically the right answer. So if we look here, I'm not going to read through the whole thing here, but if we were to go through, we would find so what if do something was set to null? So what if something was some object? So here he's got an example in the code that says a function called do something is receiving some object, but then when we call that do something method, we're passing null to it. Okay, so and then when so here's how he would solve it. That's interesting. That's good. But does this really tell us what the problem specifically is? And I'm going to say no, not really. It tells us how we can solve the problem. Maybe if we dug into the details and read through this, we could figure out exactly what the problem is. Here's another one. Ooh, and this is actually where we're getting the problem. This particular example, notice that in their code here is marked. And I'm just kind of skimming over this. If you guys took, I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible here. So obviously this would take you a bit more time. You'd have to read through this and actually look through it. But you would find that on this particular answer, even though it's not marked as the answer, it does have a very high rating. 394 people marked this as approved. It's not the answer that the original poster marked as the answer, but 394 people came in here and thought so highly of this particular answer that they gave it a vote of thumbs up. Okay, so that's pretty good. Now, as a matter of fact, there's a really good amount of information in here, but I'm going to go back to focusing on this particular line of code that they initially put in here. And what we'll notice is that when this line of code was executed, you're saying this is where the error happens. When I tried to run .length function on this thing called foo, I ran into a problem of null pointer exception. Okay? This is where the error would happen. Now, why would the error happen? Well, what is foo set to? Null. So foo is null. It's nothing. How are you going to call the length method on nothing? Right? It's not going to happen. Are we doing something like that in our code, maybe? Let's go take a look. That's the line of code that we know had the problem, where it ran into the null pointer exception. Is it possible we're trying to call a function on something that's null? The answer is yes. We're trying to call the get first name from whatever gets returned from the get author. And I'm going to skip ahead a few steps, and I'm just going to point out where this is. And then what you guys will have to do after this is go and solve the problem yourselves. Okay? The whole point of this video is to basically point you guys in the right direction. This code that I wrote is going to be available, is available on GitHub. I will give you the link so you guys can download it, put it on your own systems, and try to troubleshoot it and solve the problem. I'm showing you how to diagnose and find the issue. It's then up to you guys to solve the issue, to solve the problem, okay? Because that's what you guys are going to be doing as junior developers. You're going to fix things. So here is the line of code that is having the problem. I'm going to show you exactly why it's happening, and we're going to use what we know from what we read to find out exactly where that problem is. So the get first name method is being called on whatever comes back from the get author method on a book. Now, this is some interesting code. I'm going to show you guys how this works using lambda expressions. All of you guys have gone through JavaScript. JavaScript has the arrow syntax. What is the arrow syntax in JavaScript? Anybody? Anybody remember the arrow syntax in JavaScript?
Is it the for? I can't remember.
Okay. So the arrow syntax in JavaScript is where you define a function. It's a function. It's a shortened version of a function, right? So rather than saying function is going to do this code, and here's the parameter, function parameters do this code. Instead, you just do like an arrow syntax, which is parameter arrow syntax do this code. So it's a shortened version of function, right? In Java, we have the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. The syntax is slightly different in that we don't do the fat arrow, we just have a single hyphen and then the angle bracket. But this is a lambda expression. We call it a lambda expression in Java. You call it the fat arrow syntax in JavaScript. It's the same thing. Exactly the same thing. I have a function. Look at that. It's even called map. Anybody remember the map method from JavaScript? Yeah, look at that. We got a map method in Java. Who would have thought? All right. So we got the map method. It takes a function, just like the map method in JavaScript. We pass it a function. Now, what a map method does, if you guys recall in JavaScript, is it takes this like list of things, right, or an array of things, and creates a new array out of that thing by returning back some sort of thing and puts it in an array of that new thing. So we're taking these books, and we're taking a list of books, or an array of books, if you think of it as an array. It's not really an array, it's actually, it's an array list in Java. But it's like an array, okay? We're taking this array of books, we're gonna map over it. We're gonna create some new thing from our list of books. Now, what are those new things? Well, it's gonna be a new it's going to be for each one of the books, create a new book author. And we're going to return that as an array of book authors. So we're getting a set of books. We're going to map those to book authors. So we're taking an array of books and we're creating an array of book authors. Okay. Now what is going to be in that book author are these three things here: first name, middle name, and last name. If we looked at book author, I just want to show you guys this so you can follow along. Here's my book author. I have a constructor overload for my book author. And if you don't remember constructor overloads, essentially it is where when I first create an instance of a book author, I can pass in some values as parameters when I create that thing to fill in those values for me. In this case, first name, middle name, and last name. I'm passing on, when I create a book author, I'm passing along the first name, middle name, and last name of that author. And it's setting that for the first name, middle name, and last name of book author. Now what I'm returning is the author names, which is really just my array list, or my list of authors that are basically book authors, right? It's my book author list, my book author array, okay, is what my author names is. It's a list of book authors. So I'm transforming those books into book authors, and I'm simply passing along the first name, last name, and middle name of each one of the authors from each one of the books. But remember when I did get books? Who's the author for the book? Null. So if the author for the book is null, get author will return null. How am I going to call get first name function on null? Not going to work. And that's why we're having an error on line 37. Now, I'm going to show you one last thing here, and then we're gonna open it up to questions. The last thing is Spring is a series of lots of different things. Spring has a lot of different elements to it. It's got dependency injection, but one of the other things that it can do, and one of the things that I like about it, is that we can do this initialized database. Let me go to, okay, so what I have done in order to, there's a process with databases we call seeding. In other words, when you create an instance of a database, you might want to give that database some initial information. Like a great example of that is if I'm going to create a brand new application, spin up a brand new application, and I have like a login and a registration process, I might want to, like, out of the box, put in an administrator account on that application. One that already has a preset username and a preset password. That way, when I first get that application up and running, brand new, out of the box, it has some sort of admin username and password the user can log in with and then start setting up everything. If I don't do that, then how are they going to log into the application the first time? They wouldn't be able to. So I need to seed the database. I need to give the database some information initially so that that user can log in. Now in this example though, I didn't do that. I did it with books and persons. Okay, so we have a class here that I wrote called initialized database. And it is a component class. And by adding this component attribute or annotation on here, Java Spring will see this component and go run it. It'll go create an instance of it, which is fantastic. It's great because all I have to do is, if I want a class that when I first run my application, it goes and does something when it first gets loaded up and everything, all I have to do is smack this component thing on it and it's going to run. It's going to go create an instance of my initialized database class. Like, that's awesome. So then what I do is I say, okay, initialize the database. I'm going to pass into it some repositories, one for my books and one for my persons. And remember, repositories are basically the Java representation of a table in a database. So get my book table, get my person table. And then I'm going to load people and load books. So these are two functions that I wrote in this initialized database class, load people and load books. Here is where I get a count of how many people are in my repository. So how many records do I have in that people or person table? How many do I have? If it's 0, then I need to go make one. Okay, so I'm going to go and I'm going to make a new person. I'm going to set the first, middle, and last name to Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald. I'm going to save that person using, again, the JPA repository stuff. Then I'm going to do the same thing for books. If I don't have a book, go create one. It's going to be called The Great Gatsby. But anybody notice something missing from this? Right? All right. So that's essentially the root of the problem, isn't it? And that's how we find out what the root of things are. We have to, there's going to be some sort of error somewhere. Okay? Again, just to recap this, the error was here on line 37. Was that because there's something wrong with the code at line 37? You're actually muted there, Celeste.
Sorry.
Okay.
It's pointing us in the direction of the error.
Right. So it's not, like line 37 is not the error. There are strategies I could put in here. I could check to see if the author is returning null. Okay. So that is one strategy. And I'm telling you, there's a lot of different ways to fix this particular problem. I could say, do a get author, and if the get author returns null, I don't want to do this. But if it does return null, or I mean, if it doesn't return null, go ahead and call the get first, get middle, and get last name. So we could rewrite this section of code to check to see if there is an author, and that may be the right strategy. Check to see if get author is null. If it is, don't do this code. But if it is not null and there is an author, go ahead and call get first name, get middle name, get last name. That would be a perfectly valid way to solve this problem. But also, I could go to the root of the problem, which is the data itself is wrong. The data itself is missing that link between the books and the author. So we might want to go to actually fix the data. That is also a potential solution. And it's really kind of up to you as the junior developer and perhaps any boss that you might have. Maybe you come to your boss and say, I found the error. This is where it is. This is the strategy. I would like to solve it. I'd like to wrap it up in some sort of null pointer exception check. Okay. Or maybe I found that there was no author for this book. Can we have our database administrator go ahead and add a record for the author on that particular record? Okay. So at that point, we've solved, we've identified where the problem is, but the solution is a second thing altogether. It's a totally different thing, right? We can identify the error, but the solution isn't always immediately presentable as to how to solve this. You have to start asking questions about, how do you think I should solve this? As a business, as a group, how should we go about this? Okay? So, any questions at this point? Did you guys enjoy the workshop?
Yeah, I see that you're recording this.
Yes.
So is this going to be in the student resources videos?
Yeah, it's not gonna be in the repo.exeterLMS thing. We're actually building up a Vimeo collection of all the workshops. Okay, and we're gonna start putting them there because these are kind of a separate thing that we're working on. But you guys are actually my second one. I did a C# one similar to this one, and you guys are the second one. So I'm just curious on the feedback. So.
Yeah, I think it's great. When will they be available to us?
As soon as I can. as soon as I possibly can. And now as far as the code goes, like the code that is in here, it's already available. Let me go ahead and shoot you guys the URL for that, so you guys can go and solve this problem on your own. And that is kind of the second part of this. Is I've showed you guys how to identify the problem. Now it's up to you guys to go fix it. It's a good exercise for you guys to actually go and try to make this work now that we know what's broken. Okay. Java Spring Workshop. This is the one. So here is the link. I'm going to go ahead and post this up in chat. So you can go to that link. You'll find the code that I used for this example. I'll move this down over here. So you'll find the code there that I used for this example. And you guys can go download it to your systems, run it, discover the error all over again, try to figure out how to solve it, okay, and just try to resolve it. Again, this is probably one of the most beneficial exercises I think I could possibly give you, because when you guys become junior developers, that's what you're going to be doing for like months at least. For at least the first 6 months of your career is probably just going to be all troubleshooting, okay? So giving you guys this little heads up right now is, I think, really beneficial.
Yeah, I think I could have used it like a couple weeks ago, but
we're working on it. We're working on it.
I know my mentor's been really good. So I have my back-end foundations final like today,
Okay.
but I'm going to be working